A hearty welcome to everybody for the session and to the panelists also. And I'm hoping it's going to be a great discussion on compensation as such. Now, so one of the things I do want to highlight is the work that I'll be presenting is, of course, a small subset of the work that Pranav, I, and Raghu have done at ISB, where we're investigating a lot on compensation and new trends in compensation. Now, a lot of you are here because you're looking at compensation and saying, how can we make it work, right? And we do know that compensation is one of those fundamental things that have affected productivity. So the image there is of the Industrial Revolution, where, if you think about what was a big factor in productivity gains during the Industrial Revolution, one of that was introducing piece rates based on the number of items produced. And the minute that started, worker productivity went up. And that also led to huge gains for everybody involved, right? Now, one of the things that I'm going to highlight is in the past, what has happened is a lot of compensation has been about financial incentives. People have strictly thought about it as saying, how much more money can I give to people? And these approaches have been set with a rational economic model where, in general, monetary awards drive effort, right? But the world we live in and world in general, there are a lot more motivational drivers that affect how people are motivated or incentivized to do things. And so the session that I'm going to focus on is going beyond financial incentives. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a paper that I worked on a while ago. And now I'm sure most of you agree, and this is a very basic economic concept, right? That cash is fungible. Right? And what does that essentially mean? It means that, look, if I give you money, you can use that for anything that you want, right? And it has, instead of giving you goods or something else, the invention of money itself revolutionized commerce, right? Because of its fungible nature in doing things. And so one of the firms that I was involved in had these non-monetary incentives. And non-monetary incentives, by the way, are a very popular way of rewarding people for their performance, right? And there are many different ways of non-monetary incentives, and we will talk about some of them later on. One could be classified as reputational kind of rewards, where it's a trophy or a reward for performance, where you let everybody in the team know how well they're performing. So that's more reputational. But there's also another aspect where they actually give goods in kind, right? So it's either an experience-based setup, it's some kind of merchandising in lieu of cash. Now, when we started working on it, one of the things was, and a lot of work also happens serendipitously. So this was a setup where it had a new sales manager, and new sales manager are known to change incentive plans. And so they came in, and he was a person I was acquainted with, and they wanted to see if we can make things better, right? Now, setup it's essentially non-monetary incentives. So it's experiences and everything else. The company was spending a lot of money on these rewards. It was not cheap. They were not getting volume discounts or anything of that sort. The actual reward to the salesperson was much lower than what they would have gotten in a cash equivalent. So the cash equivalent part of it was much lower. And so all of this suggested that one should shift from a non-monetary setup to a monetary setup. Like, this is what rational economic theory would suggest. Give them cash, they'll be happier because once you give it to them, they will figure out how to use it and you're better off, right? So that's essentially and then we tried to test this whole thing. And what we found, and somewhat very counterintuitively, is that non-cash incentives perform way better than cash equivalents. Okay, and the reason for that is the way people think about these cash equivalents, right? In the setup that we were in, a lot of these salespeople attributed it to control. And what does that mean? So if I give you cash, it goes into the family budget, right? And so everybody has a say on it. It can go to your kids' education, it can go to a daily rent or something else. Whereas if I give you these non-monetary incentives, you're exhibiting a sense of control over these aspects, all right? And so they valued it much more than what they did for their cash counterparts. right? And this is to highlight essentially to say, look, we are thinking in a very rigid format of saying, look, cash and equivalent of cash. But how people perceive these things affects the effort that they're going to put for it as well. All right. So takeaway, at least for most practitioners here, is that you can think about non-cash incentives as fostering brand loyalty, creating lasting emotional connections, and also helping you diversify rewards. Now, the joke, of course, at ISB is my finance colleagues have been saying maybe we should all shift to non-cash and Madan should be giving us non-cash incentives as opposed to monetary setups. The takeaway is not that, in the sense that if you think about non-cash incentives, they work along with financial incentives as well. It's just saying that you need some kind of diversity in the kind of motivational drivers you use. It's not like you shift one or the other, right? So this is one example. The other example is more in terms of some recent work that I've been doing. And this is in terms of leaderboards. Now, one of the things that most of you would have known in a compensation world is the notion of tournaments. So a lot of organizations run tournaments frequently. And they do this to create a lot of engagement, a lot of energy among salespeople, and get them to participate, right? Now, most tournaments, if you look at the design of it, they reward only the top performance, right? So top 3, top 5, or top 10 performers are the only ones who get rewarded on this. What this traditionally leads to is the people at the bottom tend to disengage, right? And most of the people, once they realize they're not going to get the rewards, they tend to disengage. So we've started looking at it from a different perspective. And one of the things that we had was display of information or disclosure of information. So leaderboards, by the way, are a very common way of letting people know where they stand, right? And one of the things we did was try to see, okay, look, what if we don't disclose this information or disclose information to people? How does that affect behavior? And what we found again was there is a clear social motivation aspect to tournaments as well. There is a stigma of being the last. And so a lot of people don't want to be the last performer in this group. And so this expands this notion of tournaments to go beyond just the financial incentives of it, right? There's a social motivation saying, look, it doesn't matter where I am. As long as I'm not the last in my team, I am going to put in more effort, right? And this is again to rethink tournaments as well, okay? And this is costless to most firms, right? It is just displaying information, highlighting, whom do I put you, which cohort do I put you in, and so on. And so, at least for practitioners, the takeaway is start thinking in terms of more transparent metrics and social comparisons that could motivate employees without necessarily increasing cost. This is a costless way of increasing motivation, right? Now, the third paper that I want to talk about, of course, is done by Pranav, and I really like this paper. And it's a negotiations context, and it's with a large furniture warehouse setting. And it's very beautiful data. He has a few papers on this. But one of the ideas that he is examining in this is the role of gender, right? They have both women and male salespeople. And he's trying to understand, okay, are there differences in how they sell, how they negotiate, and who is better off, right? And what they find is essentially that female salespeople in general tend to outperform their male counterparts in terms of earnings and margins, right? And especially on made-to-order products, which is essentially things which you can customize and, get more. This is where you have more conversations with the customer and then try to come up with a price. So in these settings, he finds that women are actually better and they actually tend to negotiate higher markups. So they tend to have higher margins on their setups, especially in convex compensation structures. So what are convex compensation structures? Think of them as essentially having a certain tariff till you hit a target. And after that, you increase the tariff structures over there. So let's say you get paid 5% till you hit a target. After that, you get 7%. That essentially is a convex compensation structure. Now, what is the idea behind this is saying, look, there are also differences among people. Now, in follow-up work, which Pranav hopefully will talk about, is essentially he finds that the reason why this is happening points out to another organizational problem in the firm or some other things that people can work on. Now, what does that mean to people who are working in this space, right? It's essentially saying that women can excel in structured sales environments, especially with performance-based compensation schemes that incentivize both price as well as volume. Like if you're thinking only about price, then again, there's a problem, right? They're not giving too much freedom to firm. And this is in setups where you give some degree of control or power to the salesperson to negotiate and work on things. Now, the last paper I want to talk about before we hopefully shift to the panel as such is essentially on gamification and random rewards. Now, this is again a very popular setting in today's world. So what is the idea here? So a lot of salespeople nowadays, get these kind of random rewards, which is gamified. So I'll give you a few tokens. You use those tokens, play a game, and whatever is the outcome of the game, you get that as a reward. So think of it as a scratch card equivalent, right? Now, most firms tend to like that idea because it is exciting, it's engaging, and most of these rewards are not very high. This is not part of your main compensation, none of that. It's very low rewards. I think in our setting, it was worth less than 3% of the total compensation. And there was the maximum possible setup there. Now, what happens here is what we were interested in is when you play the game, people are definitely engaged, but is there a carryover effect? Okay. Now, the thing is, these are all random rewards. It's like playing a lottery. Okay. No, everybody understands that it's random. Okay. And there's a fair chance you will lose and so on. What we find actually is there is a carryover effect in terms of effort. So people who play the game and win a lot tend to actually perform less the next day, even though they had no reason to do so, right? And this is essentially saying, look, there are lots of incentives that we give to people expecting to solve one thing, but there are interdependencies that happen across. Now, the nature of the reward itself is really a small amount, right? So the effect is not very high. So within a few days, people bounce back. But in actual revenue terms, what we find is it's substantial. Okay, it was almost like 10% of the day's effort, right? So there is a real impact in terms of business outcomes. Firms bounce back, but this essentially goes back to saying, look, there are so many ways to incentivize people, okay, which are not necessarily monetary in nature. And they have different consequences for their behavior as such. Right? Okay. So now, key takeaways that I want you to have, and we'll have more discussions on this as we go on, is I think some of the work that I've done, work that Raghu is doing, and of course work that Pranav is doing, is to go beyond the traditional, right? And rethink compensation in terms of not just financial outcomes, but to say, look, these financial outcomes have behavioral consequences, people perceive things differently, and simple changes in how they are structured can have very significant consequences, both for the individual, they end up making more money, and for the firm as well because of the productivity gains that they could have. Right? And so a blend of different activity-based rewards, social incentives, gamified experiences can in general enhance productivity, and firms need to start thinking about compensation schemes in a much more, I guess, integrated and diverse manner. So this was just an outline. Like I said, I do have handouts which talk more about the work that at least a few of us have been doing on Salesforce compensation. And over to the MC.
So with that, let's get started. The first question that I have, and anybody please chime in, it's essentially broadly understanding what is the role of compensation schemes in encouraging sales teams and broadly employees to perform well. And when I say compensation schemes over here, typically you think of compensation as coming from two parts. One is your salary, which is fixed, which, you don't get a different salary if you perform better or worse. You can get fired if you perform worse. But then there is a variable component, which are the bonuses, right? So I'm thinking over here more about the bonuses, about how can we design those compensation schemes to motivate employees to perform well. So please, Swapnil or Tarun, why don't we start with either of you?
Sure. No, so I'll take it. Thanks, Prof. So I think objective is not single, at least the way we look at it in our setup. The first objective for sure is the outcome in terms of revenue that you want to achieve out of that team. So a good compensation plan ensures that the revenue outcome is a lot more certain than otherwise. So that's one objective. But the second objective, which is also very strong for us, is the motivational levels of the employees on a day basis. The job gets very frustrating when you're doing the similar kind of a job, especially in B2C kind of a setup. So what this does is that it motivates them that, hey, listen, while the job is getting a little stressful, this little demotivating, but there is a reward at the end of it. And that's where the communication comes into picture, that we sort of keep reiterating. And that's where what Prof. Madhu was also talking about, the leaderboard, that comes into action, that, hey, listen, there is a leaderboard. Now, whether it's the fear of being the last or the compensation of being in the reward cycle and hence achieving it. So these are the two objectives for sure, Prof, that we look at all of these plans.
Yeah, so I can give a very high level answer that absolutely yes. Compensation is one of the key means to drive employee behavior and even more so sales team's behavior. And the detailed answer is it depends on the selling situation. For instance, if I'm selling, say, AquaGuard, reach and frequency, and that's my motivator. I'll have a high variable. The task is simple, so the carrot is in front of me. I perform well. If I'm doing some very complicated B2B selling where the selling cycle takes 1 year, and if I keep seeing a high variable and a carrot in front of me, will I be able to do well? Maybe not. We've seen the TED Talks on the candle experiment, for instance. When incentives are very high, your ability to do creative work goes away. So nature of work is critical. The society we live in. I mean, there's a Hofstede theory on different cultures. People have different appetites for risk-taking and indulgence and power distance. If I'm in Sweden, my biggest reward could be a day off because I value quality of life. If I'm in US, I badly need an incentives. If I'm in India, along with the pull, I need a push as well. So it all depends on selling situation, the kind of teams you are in. And of course, the factor is that real estate or medical devices, they have a very high variable component because that drives a lot of performance. And then there are other industries like my own consulting. Variable is less for many reasons that I've covered. So it depends on the industry as well. And that's where the science is of what profs are doing, what we are doing, is that we recognize that compensation incentives are very powerful drivers. The real science and analytics is in designing the right plan because it's like a double-edged sword. So I gave a little bit of flavor as well, but I could go on and on. This is such a deep topic.
Madhu, an academic take on this, please.
Yeah, so I've of course been talking about how important compensation is. I think for me, the way I see it is it completely depends on the nature of the task that is involved, and is it one, is it many, and the degree of control that the organization wants to exert also in some ways, right? There are lots of organizations where process is very important, right? And how you go about doing the selling cycle becomes a key component of how they assess salespeople. And in those setups, maybe a variable is not the best way to do it. A fixed compensation is much more in line with that, right? And the way I see it is, do you want your salesperson to be an entrepreneur or not? If you want your salesperson to be the entrepreneur, maybe variable is the best way to deal with those things. And if you want them to follow process, set paths and all, you will go with much more of a fixed and everything else. And of course, in between, there are lots of these design elements. Of course, we are all bound by deadlines. There are quarterly reports, quarterly targets, yearly cycles, which again leads to some kind of gaming behavior. So one needs to focus on those elements as well. In general, there is also engagement involved as well, because a lot of times, it's if you think of it as a job, it's a job where rewards are not sufficient to retain you in a particular company. So how do I engage you on a regular basis so that you also feel aligned with the company's values and principles? So all those again become a part of the compensation setup. So I think there are many different flavors to compensation. And one needs to think them in a lot of depth, actually, to get the right mix out there.
So I think one of the takeaways based on the conversation, of course, there are a lot of levers that we can pull, and we'll talk about those levers. But also, more importantly, when we think about it, my question was framed as performing well, but there's more than performance over here. We're not just talking about a good salesperson or a good employee being the one who gives or does all the job or tasks which are given to them, but they're also the ones who completely imbibe the fabric, the culture of the company, who are able to motivate people around them who have some positive externalities. So when we think about compensation schemes, we have to go beyond just monetary outcomes. Monetary outcomes for the firm, we have to go beyond them to think about the growth of the firm. Right now, not surprisingly, all of these people are aligned in terms of the importance of salespeople. If you go to a surgeon, you ask the surgeon if you need a surgery, the surgeon will say yes, right? That is how they make money. All of us over here work in Salesforce. That's how we make our living. So all of us see the importance of that. But I think a more important point over here would be to think about the different types of compensation scheme or different aspects which can be used to motivate different salespeople. The panel members over here talked about variable pay, they talked about targets, and these are words which we throw around on a day-to-day basis. These are things we breathe, but maybe it would be helpful to elaborate a little bit for our audience and say, what are the different aspects over here? If you say variable pay, what do you mean? Targets, what do you mean? Leadership, what do you mean? And maybe very briefly talk about how you think they will motivate employees, how you think they will motivate salespeople, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure everybody's taking away something which they can think about and apply in their own firms. So please.
Maybe I can. So one context to add is, between cash, non-cash, short-term, long-term incentives, there's a spectrum of things you can use. So it could be, some payouts for a quick contest to career progression or stock options for long-term loyalty. For instance, in my firm, career progression is the means of incentive because variable is less, right? That's a broad thing, but at your disposal, you have a bunch of things. Recognition is very powerful, right? So recognition program, and Prof has done a lot of research on that as well. Maybe I'll color one dimension and pass it on. The dimension is what type of incentive plan. Now, if I'm in a business where I can forecast very well, ideally I should have goals, right? But there are many businesses where it's very difficult to set the goals for the coming quarter or if it's a new product launch, very difficult. But in a goal setting plan, you create territory level goals. Then how do you design the payout curves? For instance, the example of convex payout. We've seen if there's a lot of demand and if you cap your payout curve, which you need to because you need to prevent overpayment as well, salespeople will hold sales and sell every other month. If there's some incentives because they want to make sure that they are able to meet the sales target next month as well, right? There are a bunch of things, but your ability to forecast is critical to have goal plans. In the absence of that, people work with commissions, for instance, because you get a percentage of whatever you're able to sell and the upside could be infinite. Right? But then that becomes very unfair because a Pune territory may be very tiny compared to a Mumbai territory. So that's one choice or trade-off you need to make. The other is you do ranking plans. If you don't want to have the risk of overpaying in terms of both commission and bonus, then you rank people on any metrics, right? One very creative thing I saw in one of our students was in industrial chemicals. And actually it's a saying that if your incentive plan can't fit a visiting card size, in terms of the clarity of communication, it's not a good plan. A lot of our executives in India disagree. They say, make it so complicated that nobody understands, and then they'll work hard to figure it out. But it should be very simple. And in that case, it was a very, very clean thing. On one axis was share, the other was share change. And if I'm a high share territory, and if I do a high share change, I get the maximum. But the other two factors are also there, because these two go against each other. It's easy to go from 0 to 1 to 2, which is 100% share change, but it's a tiny territory. Or sales versus discount. So I can drive a lot of sales by giving a lot of discount, but the highest payout is where I drive the maximum sale with the minimum discount. That's a plan for an industrial chemical situation where territories, it's a key account selling situation, and it's very different between the kind of accounts I have versus Madhu may have. So the design of the plan, I think, is critical to the selling situation. There are various plans at our disposal. That's one aspect I colored a bit.
No,
more.
absolutely.
Completely makes sense.
Tarun,
Sure.
you any particular aspect of the compensation scheme, any particular lever which you think deserves a mention? Give us some example where you've applied it, where you've seen an improvement in performance, or maybe not. I mean, it's okay to talk about failures as well. So, please. You can think about quotas, you can think about targets, you can think about higher marginal commissions like convex rates we brought up. We were talking about frequency of payment.
Correct.
So any of those examples?
Surely. So at our end, so in fact, look at it like this, as Tarun rightly said, there is no one size fits all. It's all very specific to specific kind of a sales team that you are setting the entire agenda for. So just to illustrate it via an example, we have teams in our organization at broadly 3 kind of salary levels that they get hired. And see, salary levels are different because that's the level at which the talent gets attracted with that kind of salary level given the education background that we seek or the kind of communication skill that we seek. What we did is that firstly we launched one program for all the 3 teams, and that worked only for one team and did not work for the other 2 teams. Why? Because we realized that there were some certain important variables that we completely missed out. The variable number 1 is that the socioeconomic background of these candidates are very different because of the salary backgrounds and the education backgrounds that they've come from. A student, a young grad who's studied from a well-off English medium school comes with a certain family background, a certain kind of a monetary reward is meaningless. So it didn't excite them at all. While for others, it was fairly high. The second part, what we realized is that besides the socioeconomic background of your sales force, what becomes a very important variable is what Prof mentioned about is the payment cycle. So for example, you launched a weekly target and incentive plan for a vertical which has actually a 15-day payment cycle. So it fails. So your frequency of target and incentive has to be linked with the payment cycle in itself. There are certain verticals where your payment cycle in itself is around 6 to 7 days. So weekly works the best there. But if your payment cycle is a 15-day or a month cycle, then it has to be a monthly target and incentive cycle. So that's another factor which worked a lot. The third aspect which we have realized very clearly is, again, saying out of an example, we saw that there is one guy in a sales force of close to 550 people who regularly for 3 quarters kept winning one reward. And that was the reward on quality performance, not on the revenue matrices. And we were surprised. And then I sort of reached out to him that, hey, listen, this is the third one, and he's not the best performing one in the revenue category. So he said, for me, the fact that in a quarterly event, there is CEO there who is giving the reward to me is the high point for me. And that incentive that I earn monthly maybe is not that high point for me. So I think different people have their own different satisfaction levels, and that's where it works the best. So I don't know, Prof, whether I...
No, absolutely. I think the importance of social recognition over there, importance of frequency. I mean, I promise that, I will not say anything. As an academic, it's difficult to sit here and listen to others without saying something. But one of the studies which I looked at was also about the frequency of incentives, and it was very interesting because you could think about creating annual incentives. You could think about taking the same annual incentive or target, breaking it down into quarters. So you give person an incentive of reaching 10 lakh rupees in a year, or you say it is 2 lakh rupees, 2,50,000 rupees every quarter. It should be the same, right? It doesn't matter, but turns out it does. Why? Because that 10 lakh rupee incentive is going to motivate the high performers. But what about the low performers who never reach the 10 lakh rupee mark? They can still reach 2,50,000 rupees in every quarter, so they would still be incentivized. So just by changing the frequency of your incentives, you can actually engage different types of performers. Right? Again, just a small insight coming from what otherwise might seem as a negligible or a trivial change made to the compensation scheme can change employee motivation. Right? So over to you, Madhu.
As in, I was waiting to jump in. So, actually, going back to some of the things, right? Instead of talking about type, one of the things that I am more gung-ho about and very keen on is essentially the heterogeneity that is there in salespeople, and how in today's world, I think we can start looking into some of those differences within Salesforce. Of course, there are organizational difficulties in implementing that. And the reason why I'm pointing out is, like, I think Raghu has some really good work in that space. And there's another one that Sarang, Raghu and I are working in a very different setting. It's on health policy setting with field officers, health workers out there. And they're entering new markets. So going back to the problem that he was talking about, forecasting is problematic. It's a new territory. People do not know what's happening. And so what kind of compensation structures do you set up? And what we find is actually, many different compensation types do work. So, you could have a fixed compensation type and you could have a variable setup. They both work. They're both efficient. But it boils down to the kind of organization you are. Right? In this kind of setting, in health policy essentially, or health workers, it turns out the people who align themselves to being more related to being medical workers, to making a change in society, seem to work great with fixed wages, whereas people who are much more thinking of themselves as representatives of the organization were good with compensation and variable pay. So I think one can start disentangling this in many different ways, right? I think there is no one size fits all solution in compensation, and I think that's what makes this space very interesting. It depends on what you want to do. It depends on who you are as an organization. It depends on the category, and then it depends on the individual as well. And so with so many layers out there, I think for organizations coming to efficient setups, I think is going to be, a lot of good work in terms of data. And the thing is, it's not that it's not available. I think a lot of these insights are already available, but we have to go beyond the familiar in terms of, this is what the competition is doing. Because what the competition does might work for them, but not for you.
Correct.
And if I may just add one
Please.
point, because you may have felt this is all over. So many different types of things we can do, right? I think one or two unifying themes is there has to be agency. And I also have a hypothesis on Madhu's findings on the random rewards one. But agency is critical. And agency basically means the employee or the salesperson should feel that they are able to drive their well-being through their input. It's like Vroom's expectancy theory. You put in the inputs, you get the outputs. Agency manifests itself in very simple situation. I'm selling domestic water purifiers, so it's number of calls, right? Lagging indicators in terms of the sales that I achieve. But if it's a complex selling situation, you move to leading indicator. How many demos I've given, how many POCs and pilots I do. So there are ways to build that. And the other is fairness. It's such a big topic, but the one thing that can break an incentive plan is if anybody perceives it to be unfair. That's critical. So you can Google the capuchin monkey experiment. We won't spend time on it. And you can figure out how powerful this concept of fairness is ingrained in all of us. So that has to be the biggest
Tarun, since you
criteria.
mentioned the experiment,
Yeah.
please take a couple of minutes. We don't want everybody to just
Okay,
be
so
thinking about
quickly,
it.
so two monkeys, they are in cages, they can see each other, they've been hungry for a few days, and the experimenter gives them a task to do, okay? They have to do a task and the reward is grape for one monkey. Second monkey does the same task, the reward is something more simpler. I think it is watermelon or what's the? Carrot. So once or twice it happens. Then the monkey sees the other person is getting a grape, I'm getting a carrot. It's hungry. Despite that, it throws away the carrot. Literally doesn't accept the reward, despite being hungry because of perceived unfairness. It happens, my salary was less, my bonus was less, I worked harder. So there has to be very, very overt focus on making sure it's clear to understand and it's fair. So that's the agency and fairness part of it.
Let me just ask all of you over here, how many of you, just by show of hands, have been in situations where you know you're doing something which will hurt you, but you do it because you think the other thing is unfair? Right? Put differently, what I'm trying to get at is, you know that something unfair was done to you, so you're going to respond in a way which will hurt you, just because you're unhappy with the unfairness. How many of you have behaved that way? Anybody?
Oh, I'm sure with your siblings and your partners, you've all done it. You should all be raising your hands.
I think there are two types of people over here, right? I mean, some have raised hands, the other ones have not. I think two types of people. One who are publicly willing to accept they've engaged in the behavior, the other who have not. Right? So, okay. But Tarun, you preempted a lot of my questions over there. You talked about agency. The reason why we are here talking about compensation schemes and motivating people is because their effort is unobserved. Right? What does that mean? Think about a manager who can sit with his or her employee the entire day, making sure the employee follows all the check boxes and completes all the tasks, regardless of the outcome. So if the person diligently follows all the processes, we will reward them for their effort. Unfortunately, effort is not observed, which is where we end up creating these compensation schemes which reward based on outcome. This is something Tarun just touched on, which was POCs, demos, and so on and so forth. So my question over here is, should we have compensation schemes which reward people for effort? Effort meaning setting things such as, if you make these many calls, if you but if you put in effort along something, that may not result in an outcome you want. But if you put in effort, we will reward you. Right? So should we have those behavior-based incentives, or should incentives be only based on outcomes, which is revenue or profits or sales and so on? So Madhu, why don't you start first?
Okay, so answer is yes, because my research says so. So I do have work in the space where we ask this very simple question on should you incentivize effort as opposed to outcomes. And the issue that most people face, going back to what Pranav was using, is even the effort measures are noisy. They are not observed very well, and a lot of times it's self-reported. Right. And so when those things happen to you, incentivize, and what we end up showing actually is it still helps. Now, the obvious case to be made is, you have certain processes to be followed, so incentivize those processes. But what my research actually shows is it actually helps with the final outcome as well. Even if it is self-reported, even if the measure is noisy, even people are faking things, it turns out the minute you start incentivizing any kind of signals that salespeople have which are aligned with outcomes, it turns out it's good. You should not shy away from incentivizing these setups.
If I was to interpret what you're saying, Madhu, even if there is some bias in sales people or your employees reporting something where they're reporting statistics which might be misleading, the very fact that you're incentivizing them for engaging in certain good behavior might be helpful, would lead to positive outcomes.
It leads to positive.
And more in complex situations.
Yeah.
If it is very basic situation, then outcomes are easy. But complex, you see, the thing is that if I have to have a very complicated deal to go through, often the factors under my control are lesser. So I just don't want the end outcome to be the only motivator. And the effort should be observable. One technique we do is performance frontier. We look at the best performing people and then we compare them to the average, not the poor performance. Then there'll be a huge gap in their behaviors. The average and the best. The delta in observable behaviors also gives you what are the things that make a difference. For instance, in sales, one client just found, very simple but very powerful, that the performance frontier sales rep never starts a call with a new topic. They always pick on something that they left off from the last one. Very simple, right? But that's a huge difference in their performance. Okay, so somehow we have to codify these input or like leading indicators into the compensation or the incentive program in situation where there are many things. It's not easy to sell. If I have to sell, say, surfactants to Procter & Gamble, I have to change their production line. So I have to convince multiple stakeholders from procurement to the scientist to the engineer, right? If everything is contingent on the end deal, my creativity will always be constrained. So it's always a combination. I firmly believe that.
Absolutely. And Swapnil, your take on this, because you lead a sales team which is calling people, asking them to enroll in different programs on Adda platform. So and as I understand, a lot of your compensation schemes are essentially geared towards outcome, which is how many conversions are there. But in a setting like yours, would we be able to incentivize the sales team on the number of phone calls that they have made? And what could be the potential downside of doing it?
Sure. So in fact, let's take it as two use cases in our current setup. One use case is where on an average, sales guy ends up generating close to around 10 to 12 orders in a month, which will result into his target achievement at a simplified level. While compare it to another vertical where this gentleman has to do 100 orders in a month to achieve the target for the month. So these are two diverse examples. In case of 10, the process becomes a lot more important because the number of times he did the follow-up, number of times he sent the data to tell the consumer, the prospective consumer, that this is an ideal course for you. The number of times he actually did the right interventions, including a video call, becomes extremely important. So in the setup where there are 10 orders expected at the end of the month, the 100 order setup in a month expects one to do rigorous job on a daily basis, talk to a lot of people, do basics right. Eventually, it'll get the order at the end of the month. So what we do in the first setup is where we do a lot more emphasis on the entire process. So it's a blended target and a blended incentive, which means that there are a lot of factors about effort which are qualifiers. That if you achieve the qualifiers, then only you are relevant for the eventual incentive, though incentive payout is on revenue. But the qualifiers are the effort qualifiers. So that's one model. The second model is in the 100 order setup, where it plays a lot more emphasis on the actual revenue, because if actual revenue has been achieved, it fundamentally makes the statement that the process has been followed. So these are two sort of examples where we've experimented. Simple answer is it's blended. You can't play with just one aspect. You need to play with both and vary based on your processes.
And again, I think this is important because within an organization, I mean, Swapnil talked about this earlier as well, right? Where there are three different layers at which, or tiers at which employees are hired, and different salary levels, and certain amount of training works for one group but doesn't for two other groups. A program works for one but not for the others. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. What Swapnil is also talking about here is that heterogeneity also goes to when we think about compensation, when we think about activity-based incentives versus outcome-based. And sometimes it is a combination of both. It is not either or, because in some cases you might have to say if a salesperson reaches or an employee reaches a certain minimum process threshold, only then we will incentivize outcome. Put differently over there, you don't want your employees or sales team to reap the benefits of a good demand cycle or a good market. If everything happened because the market was good, then I should not get a lot of benefit for that. I still have to follow some due process, right? Okay, so I'll switch gears a little bit over here. I don't think in today's world any panel, any discussion would be complete without an ode to generative AI and large language models. As research director of IIDS, I also feel it is my responsibility to talk a little bit about the role of data science, and not talk but get some thoughts. So again, question to the panelists over here, and based on your experience, based on everything that you've seen over the years, how has the advent of generative artificial intelligence, of large language models such as ChatGPT, Claude, and so on and so forth, have changed a company's ability to customize compensation plans, to tailor them at each individual employee level? Because now we have much more data, we have better tools. So in theory, we could do that. But then on the flip side, how does that trade off against fairness and equity concerns? I know you mentioned this, Tarun, earlier, because I can create a separate compensation scheme, different salary for each one of you. But then you might be unhappy because another friend of yours, colleague of yours, has a different scheme, right? So how do you trade off these? So,
the interesting thing is a very, very simple plan with very few factors will be less fair in the sense that it won't be able to include a lot of variability across territories. Now with AI, we've been able to bring in a lot more factors or drivers of, say, untapped potential in a market. Two different markets, it's a consumer product, but it's determined by, say, weather conditions and macro factors and on. Earlier we couldn't do it, now we can bake in those elements as well. So the plan type has to be the same, but the ability to ingest more third-party real-world data sources is increasing with AI. So I feel that we are able to do better with AI because its ability to ingest a lot more information than before. I'll give you two stories on Gen AI, very quick ones. So one use case is, every organization has got terabytes of learning material, okay? So this client said that our strong people enrolled in these courses. Of course, the courses are in video and audio and PPT and PDFs and all. Can you use Gen AI to infer what are the competencies that have been covered in these courses and then give us some kind of a correlation? So very, very interesting use case. They also said that then also let us know what are the competencies which are underserved in our organization because we don't have good training material. So Gen AI is very powerful in some of these enablers. The other piece was we are already doing it. It's like the flight simulator. We've got a lot of these now, sales simulators for salespeople. And earlier simulators, the Turing test, of course, has been passed, where the ability for you to interact with a chatbot for an extended period of time without you knowing that you're talking to a machine, I think now is possible. But we have created these virtual rep trainers where it's a deep domain oncologist knowing a lot about the science who you're talking to. And based on that interaction, you get trained in a safe setting. So these are two examples of Gen AI, which are kind of tied to performance, not directly to, of course, motivation.
Sure. Madhu?
Yeah, so my insights are basically coming from the discussions I've had with the industry and everybody else, right? And this is not even Gen AI, because Gen AI is more recent. This is an example from 3-4 years back. This is a tech company which was trying to get more personalized messages out. So they used to have a lot of digital/physical presence. So a lot of the inbound leads were all digital, and then you move to a salesperson. But what they did for the salesperson was very interesting, in the sense that they got a video done by the salesperson and then used customization and personalization to have the same video. When it goes out to different people, it is personalized and customized to what they are looking for, and having a message relayed in a certain fashion based on what the the client is looking for. And to me, that was, and they actually had good outcomes also from it, because the minute you make this personalization connect, especially in B2B kind of settings, people understand that you've done your homework at least, right? And that starts the conversation. And it was very effective. So to me, that is essentially saying, look, even the way sales is done now is changing. And, client is not going to give you that amount of time. They expect information to be had much before. The face time is to finish things. Okay, everybody values their time, so get everything out. And that is where I think all of these things are going to make sales very different.
Sure. And Swapnil, I know, having worked with Adda24/7, you use data really well, extract a lot from the data. So how has the use of generative AI and large language models, I know you use a lot of them, so how have they changed your ability to create compensation schemes? And do you worry about fairness and equity concerns in your organization?
No,
I guess the answer sitting here is yes, but how?
No, we mean it. So two different examples. One is at an org level, we have close to 14 to 15 lakh transcripts or voice logs on a monthly basis of the conversation that our sales guys do. And the conventional method to check them was to let another human hear that and give a score. That, hey, listen, this happened well, this did not happen well. Today, we are doing it completely through AI. So all voice logs through speech to text, and then further the layer of an AI on applying natural language questions on the text gives us very clear answers on the problem areas, defect areas, the quality of conversation, and it's helping build the quality of conversations that our sales guys do. It has helped us immensely in last 6 months. So that's one area which has really worked wonders for us. And it just doesn't work wonder in terms of understanding the problems. It also works wonders in terms of the impact that the training is creating on the sales guys. So that's one area. The second area, Prof, a lot more closer to what we have discussed also multiple times over. What we have done is that, so when we started, there were close to 20 odd verticals in the organization. And hence, the sales team of one vertical was one single unit. And they used to have same target and same kind of incentive model. What we realized is that we need to create homogeneous buckets within every vertical because of the opportunity that is going to the sales guy. So for example, one of the thing that we did is that we tried to create a model to predict propensity to pay of the consumer. And all sales guys working on the same propensity to pay have the same target and the same incentive model. And that has helped the entire fairness aspect quite a lot. So you need to create the homogeneous buckets within till the point you have reached to that unit, which looks extremely homogeneous. Your targets and incentives will not work very well.
No, that's great to know. I think my takeaway from that is there are two different use cases over here. One is not so much about compensation, but one is about alignment of salespeople, checking whether they're following the processes, whether the conversation that they're having is in line with what the mandate that is given to them. The second one is talking about how do we ensure fairness. Fairness over here comes from saying that salespeople now are given leads, are given opportunities which have the same score, and the compensation is tailored to that, so that no two salespeople who have different leads, different opportunities, have the same compensation, or put differently, two salespeople with same opportunities have same compensation, don't have different compensations, right? So now the last part, and we're almost out of time, so just very quickly, is the role of compensation schemes different in business to business contexts versus, let's say, business to consumer settings, right? So we talk about B2B, we talk about B2C. I think a lot of folks over here would come from different industries. So is the importance of compensation, is the importance of, not the productivity part, but how we think about compensation different in these contexts? Who would like to go first? Madhu, you go ahead first.
Okay, so answer is a definite yes, right? Again, it depends on cycle time for the product. Again, within B2C, whether you're selling electronics or whether you're selling, things off the shelf, right? Those would affect the thing. But in general, when I'm thinking B2B, I'm thinking in terms of high value items and long cycle times. And in those settings, there is a lot more business development, the word that people use, that happens. And in those setups, I think it's much more important for the salesperson to have a lot more control over the entire process. Whereas in a B2C setting, there's a lot more marketing and product and everything else that happens way before the customer lands on the table, right? So I think there, the development part of it is handled along with marketing. And so that creates a different coordination issue in some ways. But it also makes the job of the salesperson very different. Okay, so definitely yes, but once you start, thinking about products and what you're selling in terms of environment they're selling in, competition, and then of course cycle times, then you can start seeing similarities as such.
Yeah, totally agreed. Selling situations are different. Some people say oversimplification, but B2C is like, where marketing, above the line marketing has a bigger play. And the role of the sales channel is to make sure fulfillment happens. And in many times in B2B, the salesperson is doing the trade marketing as well. You're creating the collateral, you're creating the pitch and value proposition as you sell. Sometimes you create the product during the sales process. You're selling Amazon Cloud services. The product is being configured as you sell. But in both situations, I think it is very important. It's just that because of these complexities and nuances, we have to design them differently.
Swapnil?
So I think largely based on my own experience, since I handled both B2B and B2C in different contexts, I think fundamental objective, I think remains the same and serves the same purpose. But I think designing is where it changes a lot. The quantum of or the percentage of value of variable in the compensation plan in itself as the first factor. And the second is periodicity in which you reward. What do you reward? Non-cash, what is non-cash which excites them? For a B2C, a non-cash of a expensive consumer durable is extremely awesome. But for a B2B, non-cash could be 2 nights of 3 days of international travel. And of course, the affordability in both the cases is also very different. In B2B, generally the affordability as the percentage of cost of sales also is fairly high. So I think it serves the same purpose, in my opinion, in both the context. In fact, what, I think I was telling you or Tarun, that there are 2 ways in which we can present the entire compensation to the prospective employees or the current employees. One is to say that, hey, listen, your opportunity to earn is this much, which is divided into 2 parts, versus I'm hiring you at an X salary, but you can earn 30% more. So that 30% more is still a luxury which I may afford to live without, compared to being hired at a compensation plan and not being able to earn that 30% serves as a bigger sort of a push. So I think, that's the...
No, perfect. So Swapnil, the last thing that you mentioned over here gets into the domain of behavioral economics, where we're essentially talking about the fact that, you getting something makes you happy. You're not getting something or losing something makes you unhappy, but you're more unhappy than a comparable gain would make you happy. So what I'm getting at is, Swapnil said there is an opportunity where, your base is, a very simple example, 100 rupees, and you could get 50% more. That 50% more is an upside which makes you happy. But on the flip side, I could come to you and say, you will earn up to 150 rupees. The minimum that you will earn is 100. So position the second way, not earning that 50 rupees now seems like a loss, and people will be better motivated. So this gets into a whole new dimension of how we should frame incentives and how we should offer these incentives, which I'm afraid we don't have time right now. But broadly, the last point about B2B and B2C, I think to summarize the conversation over here, what I took away was the purpose of creating incentives is the same, but the differences come from three different places. Differences come from, first, the customers. In B2C, you're dealing with end users. In B2B, you're dealing with companies or clients who are not the end users. So the differences are because of customers. The differences are because of the type of employees or salespeople that you have in each of these. And the difference comes from the process. In B2C, there are a lot of other marketing activities which are going on along with the sales effort. But in B2B, for a long part, the salespeople have ownership of everything from start to end. So type of people, type of customers, and the nature of the process, all of them lead to differences in terms of role of compensation scheme in B2B versus B2C setting.